University. So we're going to have 3 panelists today, and our discussion is going to be moderated by Robert Sieczkiewicz, and he's the university archivist and actually a fellow graduate student, an alumni graduate student actually, from the iSchool. Robert?
Yes, thanks everyone for coming. I think we had a little meeting earlier in the week, and you can find everyone's not only research is interesting, what they have to say about it is interesting, and there's really some great connections. So the 3 people you'll hear from today are first Rachel Mcgee. Rachel is an iSchool doctoral candidate, and her talk today. Oh no. Her talk today is titled Teens, Technology, and Information Practices. Okay, great. Then Joesph Salomone from the Goodwin School of Education, where he's a PhD candidate. Joseph's talk today is titled Student Engagement and Online Learning, Defining and Understanding the Infusion of the Social and Academic Shared Experiences. And last is Hossein Nourzad. He is a civil, architectural, and environmental engineering PhD candidate. His talk today is titled Effective Risk Management, a Global or Local Approach.
So I did change things up a bit based on I'm going to talk about teens, and a significant part of my research is actually my dissertation. First, though, the 2 fields that I'm working within are sort of, by definition, interdisciplinary. And we'll get to that in a second. Some background about me. I was born and raised in Texas. That's a big part of my personality, if you know me at all. I got undergraduate degrees from the University of Texas at Austin, which this is our main campus tower. In English and radio, television, film. So I have a creative writing background, and I've been interested in storytelling for quite a long time. Then I went to library school, which is actually a requirement for most of the librarians in the country. You actually have to have a master's degree in library information studies. So I did that at the University of Arizona, and then worked for 3 years as a teen services librarian in the County of Los Angeles. And in that job, I was in charge of all of the programming for teenagers, as well as making purchasing and selection decisions with regards to teen fiction, nonfiction. All of the graphic novels in the library. I also supervised, I think it was somewhere around 300 volunteers over 3 years. Most of whom were teens, quite a lot of them were kids on probation. So in that environment, I started to watch how these kids were using technology. I was trying to teach them how to use a lot of technologies, and started to see that there are a lot of problems with how these information technologies specifically are designed. So a good example of this would be if you're doing research and you go to our library's database and try to find an article. It's kind of a complicated process. And it's hard for teens to learn because they're also kind of learning the content as well as learning how the technologies work. So I wanted to come to school and work on that. And that gets me to the iSchool here at Drexel. iSchools are a consortium of schools that focus on studying information. And when you look at information, very often you're looking at technology and people. So HCI stands for Human Computer Interaction. Quite a lot of our information access is governed by computing technology now. So that's why I'm interested in this particular field. I'm also interested in information science, which really looks at the traditions of how we manage, store, organize, and make accessible information. And there I am in the middle. To get a little more specific about HCI and why it's interdisciplinary, it involves, this is from Wikipedia, one of my favorite resources to talk about. HCI involves the study, planning, and design of the interaction between people or users and computers. A big idea. This involves research from computer science, social sciences, and it also brings in the element of design, which really focuses on how we can change the systems and structures that we're making to improve that use. Information science is an interdisciplinary field primarily concerned with the analysis, collection, classification, manipulation, storage, retrieval, and dissemination of information. We like to have lots of debates about what constitutes information. It's a lot of fun. But I'm really more interested in how we can make information access better through better technology design. Both of these fields have systems backgrounds. That's how they started. We were looking at computing and trying to make computers work. And once we started getting that going, and once computing started really entering regular people's lives, a user-centered orientation really came out of that. Meaning that you people who are user-centered, which includes me, are very interested in making sure that people are the priority as we design these systems, because they're the ones who are going to be using them. So now I'm going to kind of talk about two studies that I'm working on that sit within this sort of overall world of HCI plus information science. The first is my dissertation work that I'm beginning, looking at teens' information and technology practices. And then I'm going to hit on the big winner, user-defined success in online dating. This is a lot of fun to talk about. So I'm interested in teens. Why do I have this picture of a baby? This is up here because teens today, and from now on, at least in the United States, are considered digital natives. That means that they've grown up with technology being in their home. They're expected to use technologies, and there's a social conversation around this that implies that these kids know what they're doing when it comes to technologies. Everything's happy, right? And once you grow up in this environment, become an adult, you're a successful technology user. Unfortunately, if you kind of look at these faces, it gives you a better idea of what technology use is actually like for kids today. It is not always easy. And because I personally believe because of that social conception that these kids are good at technology, they're missing out on a lot of instruction, and they're missing out on a lot of support in terms of learning how to deal with these systems. So this picture I like even better because it shows you that technology use is situated. It happens not in an academic setting all the time. It's out in the real world. It's gritty. It's hard to manage. And because of that, because of those social and cultural contexts that exist, I'm interested in technology and information choices and practices outside of school, outside of work, in your sort of normal everyday life. And I'm using an idea from Salomone, which is called Everyday Life Information Seeking, which is really focusing on that sort of other end of things. This sort of comes out of traditional information science and computer development that really focuses on how we can use these technologies and systems for work. Improving work, efficiency, these are all a huge driving force in early HCI and information science. And now as we're developing that user orientation, we're starting to realize that we actually interact with these things quite a lot outside of those really important situations. And to talk about one of those really important situations that doesn't have to do with work or doesn't have to do with academics, talk a little bit about online dating success, which is a study that I recently did with another doctoral student in the iSchool named Christopher Mascaro. We collected online dating success stories from 3 websites, Match.com, eHarmony, and OkCupid. And these were publicly available stories that were submitted by successful couples who had self-defined as successful. And we wanted to see what success looks like. It's often talked about as marriage in, again, kind of getting at that, oh, it's serious, it's worth thinking about. But we suspected that there are other ways to think about it. This is word clouds from each of the sites that kind of give you a picture of what these stories we're talking about. We actually did a word analysis through a statistical package called R, program called R, and found that approximately half of these stories actually specifically thanked the online dating site that they used, which really to us means that they're seeing this technology as an important actor or factor in the development of their relationship. That's a bigger deal than, oh, I just went to this site. It's really important to a lot of the people that are describing these successes. Also, this kind of gives you a picture of the different types of success statuses by website. Over on the left is eHarmony, not surprisingly. 84% of the success stories we sampled there. We sampled 20% of the available stories from each of the sites, which resulted in a sample of about 850 stories. 84% of eHarmony considered marriage to be a success. 47% on Match thought marriage was a success, whereas on OkCupid, 49% thought dating constituted a successful experience with an online dating website. This, to us, kind of indicates that there are different cultures on all of these sites. Different people are using these, and they have different expectations of success. So what are the big ideas? The fun stuff. Technology isn't just a tool, and it isn't always easy. It's highly integrated into very important elements of people's lives. And work and school are not the only ways for us to think about what's important. And that leads to the larger idea that when we're looking at technology or people, you have to have an interdisciplinary background, because to be able to understand the systems and to be able to understand the people, you really have to know how both of those fields work. You guys have any questions? You can always be moved to.
I guess this also goes with the last question, is that they talked about different aspects of generations and stuff like that. So I imagine in human-computer interaction, you actually have to deal with that a lot, because whereas not necessarily age or even technology aptitude, but even that different demographics were also considered that will actually require different interfaces to successfully interact with the computer. Do you find this true, and like how do you even, I guess, quantize it?
I want to be careful with saying that it's generations of people are more technically adept than others, because it's really experiential. And I think that, to borrow a term from information science, your literacy with technology really develops out of having a scaffolded experience. So I think no matter which generation you're looking at, you're going to have the people that are very inexperienced and very experienced. So to that, that is true. And there are lots of different ways to design for different skill sets. There's sort of competing ideas within HCI of, do we design for universal usability where anybody can sit down and use this, or do we design for people that are power users that don't need to be instructed on how to use this system? So it's not solved. It's a big debate going on in the field right now, and it really does come out of the focus on users. Once you start thinking about users, things get incredibly messy, because there are lots of different types of users.
Are you seeing any, I don't know that you would ever get hired, because dating websites that are...
I haven't seen one that's specifically just for teens. Although I did see one that this past week that was, I think it's called What's Your Price, where attractive people and generous people are able to basically write a contract together for a first date. And a lot of the attractive people happen to be women who were 19. I think this is it's something that people do. One of the things that we've also found is that when you're looking at online dating websites are not the only place where you meet people and develop a romantic or sexual relationship. That happens on Facebook, it happens on MySpace, and those are sites that tend to.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joesph Salomone. Just a little bit of history about myself. I originally am from New York. I went to school. I started school at Columbia University. I transferred to Drexel many moons ago, and ever since then I've been at the university for about 20 years now. So when I completed my undergraduate degree, which was in accounting, I worked briefly as an accountant, and then I realized that definitely wasn't the field that I wanted to pursue. So I went back into, not to bash the industry, I'm sure it works for some people, it just didn't work for me. And then I decided to pursue education, so I went back to get a master's in elementary education. And then I taught briefly as a student teacher, and at that point, I was still employed at the university. So we went through a big transition with system implementations, and I became intrigued with the concept of information science and information systems. So I decided that I would go pursue a master's degree in information systems. So I finished my master's in information systems, and at that time I was starting a PhD program in education. And different things happened at the university, so I ended up completing another master's in higher ed because it was online, and I was really intrigued with the idea of technology infusing education and just the concept of learning online. So that's part of where my dissertation was born, is the concept of, having completed an online program in higher education. It was very intriguing to me, the idea of, how many students are actually having a shared experience like I am at this specific time, and how are we learning, and the whole concept of engagement. Basically, with Rachel's presentation of HCI, my track in IST was in HCI, and it was more so using the appropriate technology. But the idea of integrating technology from an end user standpoint is we're customizing graphical user interfaces and the idea of usability studies, but what is the level of engagement, and how are the people using the technology? And are we doing it from a functional or aesthetic value? And there's always like toggling those ideas. So I really became, like I said, intrigued and somewhat obsessed at one point with the idea of engagement. And I also teach as an adjunct professor in higher ed. So I have a very good perspective of a student versus an instructor. And it's interesting to say that at one point when I was in a class and I was taking these courses, I had a very different idea as a student, and then as the professor, I can easily see, how many students, were engaged, were not engaged, and it was a wonderful experience. So first, thank you for coming and hearing about my research. I wanted to go into the three concepts that I'm going to be talking about. Understanding the interactions and impacts of specifically web technologies and the social media revolution. Engagement, and I'll have a definition of engagement in the age of social media and what we mean by social media. What are some concepts of engaged learning? Engaged learning models are they models or somewhat of misunderstandings of how they're applied to online learning? Many of them are infused and grounded in on-campus programs and classrooms where we can monitor body language, expressions, and that information doesn't translate very well to online unless we're using maybe technologies where we can actually see the learner or the student. I'll talk about the birth of my study, which I previously did, and then my PhD timeline, and if there's any questions. So, what happened with Web 1.0? Web 1.0 was an early attempt with the information superhighway with the uses of information in a hierarchical structure. Basically, it was a need-to-know basis. So many people, it had a very narrow focus. Web pages were very static. It was just information sharing, devoid of a dynamic, devoid of interaction. There were many PDFs. Just as an example, when I really studied in IST, I took one of their online classes in the early stages of the evolution of online learning. And today, having taught and taken courses in higher ed, the model of the program is very different. It's much more interactive. And then it was information sharing. It was relatively PDFs. It was basically the textbook online. So the interaction was, and in fairness, the time necessitated that. But with the explosion of the social media, and we'll talk about Web 2.0, a different paradigm. And as we approach Web 3.0, you'll see that the times are really changing. Communications that were crafted specifically, there were approval chains. It was a one-way interactive communication. It was reactive, directed, and controlled. And it was archaic, but it was a step towards the future, like I had explained. Okay, with the onset of Web 2.0, we see a very user-centric environment. It's very social, it's open data, it's collaborative, emotional, it's discussion-based, it's very proactive, it's real-time where everyone wants to publish things. Their posts, their statuses, everything is in real time. Also, it's very immediate, and it develops a community-based understanding. Now, this is the explosion with devoid of a contextual framework, as we talk about the Web 2.0, and even as we move into Web 3.0. So the social media explosion has caused a wonderful opportunity for us to start defining the context of how we are using such technologies as integrated in learning in general, and many of the philosophies of cognition, constructivist theories, and I'll cover some of them. But, as I've labeled this, it has power and potential, but we have to define and understand the context in which we're using it. What is engagement in the age of social media? Well, this is quoting actually a professor in IST, which actually tries to understand the infusion of technology and the use of technology as it infuses engagement or learning. So to be human is to be engaged with other people in the world. As we sit here now, we all are developing a different understanding of what I'm saying, but I can see visually, unless maybe there's really good actors, of the students that are really or maybe thinking somewhat from an idea of who's engaged. So we can see that learning is a very social element. And when we learn, it talks about the infusion of how we understand. And based on our shared experiences, we develop and convert that information into knowledge. And that knowledge is ingrained from a cognitive standpoint, and we share it. And that's how we internalize it. It's a very tacit, and then it becomes, we put our personal touch on it, we share it with each other, and then we create knowledge based on it. So what does it mean as part of the social media revolution? And these are some of the concepts that I am, undergoing right now. Or what does it mean as part of online learning? Many students have developed, and people in general, have developed an idea of what social media is, and it's ingrained as part of their life. So when we add an element of online learning, how do we transition that behavior to ensure that we're successfully teaching online? Or how are we engaging it? Or channeling some of that active engagement from social media into online learning? What is the relationship of engagement to technology as fueled by the use of social media? Does technology drive engagement, or is engagement an entity within itself? So just because we have a wonderful learning management system doesn't mean that everyone in that class is going to be engaged. There are strategies and protocol that we need to ensure based on theorists, which I'll go into, that have defined the infrastructure under which engagement can occur. So I've used an example here by Kersley and Snyder, which was in 1999. But as stated, much of the ideas and understanding of engaged learning have been based on face-to-face and the classroom, outside of the classroom, and learning environments within a collaborative nature. But just to go over some of the most important aspects of this discussion, creating successful collaborative teams that work on ambitious projects that are meaningful to someone outside of the classroom. The three components are summarized by relate, create, and donate. So we have the idea of authentic learning and the context and collaborative teams. So the idea of we're putting learning within a context where it creates a social aspect, and by integrating people in collaborative teams and sharing that degree of social element, it helps learning and moves learning forward. So the most important things are project-based and have an outside authentic focus, which is the basis of constructivist theory and the idea of making learning relevant, which is why we are in higher education. We would like to say that all of our classes upon graduation are very relevant to the real world. We don't study antiquated topics from the 1800s. Within a context we do to see the evolution. But as we graduate, we would like to say that we're current and relevant in our industry. Engaged learning, and I entitled this Models or Misunderstandings because authentic activities has always been a concept of engagement and also the use of communities and collaboration. The idea of engagement originally thought of as a two-dimensional model, as I've described what Code says, which is the basis of my jump off from my research, is that engagement was actually confined in a two-dimensional model, occurring in different quadrants, but it was more, and I'll show you the next slide, where was the intersection of the social and the academic. But it also involves the behavioral, emotional, and cognitive, which we've learned from, the psychologist theory, and relevant, participatory, collaborative, and it has to be challenging, which you can see as the migration of many of these in 2011, we start moving towards the idea of it has to be authentic. It has to be something that can be applied because authenticity and relevancy brings about engagement and the idea of where is this going? It spurs creative thought. The model that Coates had defined was mostly two-dimensional, where at any one point, students can experience the intersection of academic and social as a collaborative approach, as an intense, passive, and independent. But rather than explain engagement in a two-dimensional model, engagement is more or less all of these occurring more or less in a cable. Like if you have a phone wire and you cut it and then you could see the various wires of the coax, or depending on what type of internet speed you have, I think it could be. I'm not going to go into discussions of network theory. But the idea of the intertwining of those cables create the electrical charge or the current. So each one of those at any one time, when the power is not supplied to them, it doesn't create the ultimate end effect. And that's how engagement is. Many of these are occurring at varying levels. So the infusion of all of these is what creates the concept of engagement. The need to jump off from beyond the two-dimensional approach of student engagement and online learning is basically some of the topics that I've reviewed and the basis of why further research is needed. Learning is social and knowledge is constructive. It's grounded in constructivist theory. We all learn differently. My view is not essentially your view, so the idea of having a Web 1.0 approach where we have a dictator and I'm telling you what you should learn doesn't function very well because we all learn differently. And part of that understanding and collaboration is what helps us understand the concepts and create knowledge. Engagement learning is an infusion of many factors, and students have the following. I've covered this. Collaborative intent occurring simultaneously and at varying levels. It's beyond the two-dimensional quadrant approach, and theories and research are grounded in on-campus courses and programs which don't necessarily lend themselves very well to online programs. So when programs are created online, a great amount of thought is put into it of how we can best serve the students, accommodate the pedagogy, and understand and master the learning outcomes. So much of that model, when people move an on-campus program online, the on-campus was created very differently and for very different learning outcomes. So that transition to some, when they develop courses online, is very difficult. So much of it is a best practice approach that needs to, but the most important thing is the student experience needs to be a heavily considered factor. And more importantly, what is the student experience, and I said, and more importantly, perception of what they're doing. What is their perception of engagement? I'm going to be researching 3 graduate online programs here at the university from a survey that was adapted from the NFEE. It's grounded in the 7 principles of promoting and sustaining good undergraduate learning, which is Chickering and Gameson. Many of you, if you studied Chickering in the social sciences, his concepts are mostly related to engagement, developing a personal approach, why students leave college, students don't feel as though they're part of a whole, like the community building. It's heavily grounded in that type of research. I'm also going to be doing personal interviews and a mixed model approach, which would be the concurrent triangulation strategy, where the quantitative and qualitative are going to be done simultaneously with the idea of comparing and analyzing the data so that we're not building in a sequential model where much of the research is based upon what I've learned from the previous, because we really want to understand the issues here and tease out a lot of the issues that I may have missed based on some of the strategies that I had actually employed. The benefits of the study of understanding engagement, it provides a deeper understanding of engaged learning. It can aid in online curriculum and course design, which I covered. It can aid the faculty in a sensitivity and overall awareness of when a student may not be engaged or best practices for developing engagement strategies. It could help improve retention in online programs as defined by Chickering and also Tinta, which are major researchers in attrition and retention in higher education. It can help online students by providing a community as well as a community of understanding. Develop the best practices, which we've discussed, and further, most importantly, advance the research of engaged learning. I should be finished my defense in December, but right now I'm in the survey stages where I'm working with the National Society of Student Engagement. I'm doing a modified version of one of their surveys, and much of the results and the fruition of this study will be done this year. So, thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Okay.
I don't think it's surprising that I'm interested in K-12 here, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the transition from high school to a college environment, and does that add to the difficulty of using online education?
Well, it does, with the extent of how many, you know, I know you hear this a lot, I'm sure we all do, that sometimes they say that, oh, students, and actually students that are in grade school and high school are really tech savvy and they understand, but it's the context of which they're using it, and you know you're the crowd on HCI, that when they move from that paradigm into another, the context and the learning outcome changed. So then therefore, how they used it, they're using it differently. And sometimes, even though they're performing the same actions, the outcome is different, so they get lost. So to answer your question, without the context of which it's being used and the integration appropriately, as well as the training, they could very well fail and be tech savvy. They know how to manipulate Facebook, change their statuses, post a variety of things. But when used in the context of learning, it becomes much different. Well, you know, everyone is using something socially for fun, and then when they're using it to learn, it's not fun anymore. So part of the issue is to make that course engaging, to understand it, and develop learning outcomes that integrate and engage students, not only from the end user standpoint of how the application or the learning management system is designed, but develop strategies to bring them in, share collaboratively, and even beyond the graduate level, this could be occurring in hybrid models, which we have here at the university when freshmen enter in, you know, English, which is one of the starting points of the development of that, like defining which activities can be done best online and which could be done face to face, which was a really good suggestion. And actually, one of the individuals, Dr. Valerie Arms, who started that program, is on my committee. So she helps a lot with the understanding of the development of that model and which contexts and learning outcomes were best suited for each environment. Yes.
My name is Jai Bhatt. I am the engineering librarian, and one of the challenges that the library is facing these days is how to promote instruction and research skills to online students. And with the assumption that everything is on Google, and a lot of times the online distance learners don't realize the number of online databases that the library subscribes to. And how do we go about making sure that those online learners, the distance learners, take advantage of all these tools? We get a lot of times phone calls at the desk that I'm a distance learning student, and they have no clue that there is a library catalog exists, even because of these kind of things happening.
Well, it all depends on, once again, the context under which we promote those activities. And sometimes when we're involved and heavily entrenched in a class, having been a graduate, and all of you are graduate students, and, we're here for 10 weeks, and, things sneak up on you. So the preparatory work, and part of that needs to be done far from integration into the actual course. So when you start the course, you have a set of learning outcomes, you have X assignments, and then when you start integrating a technology that you're not familiar with, it sends a student in a spiral if they haven't used it, and then they become obsessed with mastering the technology and ignoring the outcomes. So then they say, well, I finally mastered the technology, and now I don't have enough time to write the paper or to do the video or to use Camtasia. So I think that many of those auxiliary services and the types of services that are provided to online students should be tied to a more virtual university approach, where many of those support services are encompassed and encouraged outside of the classroom, so that when they have an orientation. We all have an orientation here on campus. Much of that orientation should be mastery resources, and they can easily create an online class that would be your introduction to online learning. I know when I taught within the School of Education, I, as an instructor, had to take a course to understand the idea and the cognition and learning outcomes and all of that as it related to how students learn in a classroom structure and how to translate that necessarily online. So to answer your question, yes, if it's promoted early enough and it's supported, but it usually has to come from an upper management level, like all of the deans need to buy in. It's the provost office. It needs to be a standard that's established across the university.
And also the faculty should think about integrating this early enough in the syllabus itself.
Yes,
with the contact information.
Yes. And they have wonderful online learning committees now where they're actually promoting best practices and sharing a lot of their best practices, like what the iSchool does, what business does, what the School of Education may do. And part of that is that those best practices might, to allude to what you're saying, is that if we define it early enough, we can promote it and encourage it beyond the in-the-moment approach and being proactive instead of reactive. Yes.
Have you compared degree-centered learning or learning-centered learning, and do you see there's going to be different level of engagement of students?
With a learning-centered environment, it usually talks about collaboration, and having taught in specifically grade schools and in the high school level, you have very, very clear-cut learning outcomes. But the idea is the creative infrastructure of collaborative teams. The most important way is how you design the learning environment, and to clearly make sure that the learning environment is attached to the learning outcomes. So you don't have absurd learning outcomes that will never ever be born out of the learning environment that you're. So examples, if you want them to learn how to communicate, collaborate, then you don't have individual assignments. You have a lot of group work. Also the grading schema, how you weigh things. There should always be clear-cut ideas of how the students are graded and explained. So I think it very much is hand in hand with evaluation as well.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could we
pause
our discussion?
Sure.
And let's hear from Hossein, and then we'll have a little bit of time to come back to this at the end.
Okay.
We can hear all three.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi everybody, before I start my presentation, I want to say that I have lots of risks right now. First of all is I'm the last of the 2 grades presenters. The other one is that you are full of food. The last one is that we are running out of time, but let's go and talk about the risk management, which I think is a very interdisciplinary topic. Okay. So, as you can see, my name is Hossein. I have my Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering in 2005. And after that, I started working in industry, in industrial projects like construction projects in my country, in Iran. And at the same time, I started working on my Master of Science, which is in water resource management. And what we did, we implement our research on a real project, on a real complex copper complex, on a water cycle of copper complex that I want to go through. I don't want to go through that. And after that, and also I finished my 2 certificates. One is in Master of Business Administration, MBA. And also recently I did my PMP exam and I passed. So if you have any question regarding project management, I'm glad to respond to that. So right now I want to just, very quickly, go to a conceptualized model of what I'm trying to develop for my proposal at PhD. So let's go to the, brainstorming. This is what I think. Let's say that these are, the big cycles are the companies, and that each company has different projects, right? And each project, and there are different interrelations between projects within a company and also between different companies. And there are other things like end users of the projects, as well as something like political issues or governmental issues, legal issues. So I would say the space or the environment here is actually a complex, dynamic environment that we should consider even if we want to decide about the risk of this project, right? But let's say if we go just to this company, and if we focus just to this project, the way that, these days the people are doing is that they consider just their own project, but they try to, consider some of these relationships, but believe me that those considerations are not that much. And what they do, because the subject here is risk management. What they do, as you know, the risk manager has, it is a very, I would say, common and a standard approach. The standard approach is this one, that they will try to identify the risk, and then they will qualitatively assess the risk, and then they will pick up the major risks. And after that, they will work on the major risks, and they will try to find some strategies and response to handle those risks. And this is an iterative process, because after finding some strategy, they should go back and re-estimate all things, re-schedule the projects, and after that they will so they will do this cycle. When they start the project, during the project they will always monitor the risk. This is what people are trying to do. And I would say one major product of risk management right now is a risk checklist. Actually, it's like just a list of some major risks, something like this. But the point, so let me describe the challenges here. One challenge is that actually the risks are not individual risks. They have there are correlations between even between the risks. There are correlations, and this is one of the studies that I forgot his name. That he tried to find the interrelationship between the risk by